So now then, therefore, let me turn to the next question, which is how has China won from the Ukraine war? And here it's, while in the initial phase, as I said, China has lost out as this war is dragging out, and nobody, by the way, still knows what the final outcome is going to be. We are beginning to see the emergence of new trends that could work in the favor of China. So, for example, I mentioned there has been revitalization of Western solidarity, and up to now, the West has been completely united on the Ukraine war. But it is conceivable that as the war drags on and as the costs increase, especially for the domestic populations in United States and in Europe, you will find that there might be a domestic backlash in both these countries against the continuation of the war. And as you know, gasoline prices in the US have gone up very, very sharply, and that is actually putting a lot of pressure on the administration of President Joe Biden. And as you know, President Joe Biden and his Democratic Party are very much focused on the midterm elections in November. And if inflation continues to rise, and if things get very difficult for the middle classes in America, there could be a political backlash against President Joe Biden, and therefore there could be some pressures to find some kind of a solution in Ukraine instead of taking the very hardline position that the United States has taken on the Ukraine war. In the same way, it's also possible that you might get a summer of unrest in many European countries if inflation rises and if energy prices remain very high. And certainly even a country like France, which has been quite stable, as you saw in the last elections, there was while President Macron did get re-elected as president, he lost the, what you call the Legislative Assembly elections, and though he has to deal with a much more difficult domestic environment. So even in Europe, which today seems very strong and united on the Ukraine war, there might be a certain degree of exhaustion over it, and therefore reconsideration of defense, and therefore perhaps the strong Western resolve that you have seen so far may weaken in the weeks and months to come, and therefore that would change balance between the West and China. And at the same time, there's one statistic which I want you to remember, is very important statistic, which is that only 12% of the world's population lives in the West. 88% lives outside the West. And initially, certainly initially when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, it shocked the world, and clearly you saw that over 140 states, I think, condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the UN General Assembly vote. So you got the sense that the West and the rest were united in their approach towards the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But again, over time, you see that even though the West has tried to apply very strong sanctions on Russia, and the sanctions have been quite brutal in some ways, quite effective, you actually discover that if you look at the population of the world, the percentage of the world's population in the countries that have actually imposed sanctions on Russia is only like 14 or 16% of the world's population. And 84 to 85% of the world's population have not imposed sanctions on Russia, and in fact are now saying very clearly to the West, this war in Ukraine is not just damaging the people on Ukraine. The people of Ukraine are clearly suffering, and we should support the people of Ukraine in their suffering in this war. But the rest of the world is also suffering. The war in Ukraine, as I suggested earlier, has increased global inflation, increased global energy prices, increased food prices, and therefore hundreds of millions of people in many third world countries are actually going to go hungry as a result of the Ukraine war. And the sheer indifference of the West to the pain and suffering of the poor in third world countries is becoming now very clear and palpable, and therefore leading in some ways to a backlash against the West on the Ukraine issue. And in that sense, in some ways, China's position, as I indicated earlier, is more in tune with the position of most third world countries. And actually, China, as you know, has tried to be helpful to many of them in different ways. So paradoxically, what initially seemed to be, in a sense, a united global response against the Russian invasion of Ukraine now seems very much as a Western response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with very little support from the majority of the countries in the 88% of the world's population who live outside the West. So in that sense, it's become very much a shift away from the global united response. And this is also shown in the positions that are taken by the larger countries in the third world. And certainly, and you will see this play out, by the way, both in the G20 foreign ministers meeting taking place today, that more and more major third world countries like India, like Indonesia, like Brazil, like South Africa, saying, hey, we shouldn't just focus on the war in Ukraine. We should focus on ending the war in Ukraine, working for a ceasefire, and trying to find peace in Ukraine, because the problems in Ukraine are disrupting lives, not just in Ukraine, but disrupting lives all over the world. And just yesterday, I got a WhatsApp message from a senior Indonesian diplomat in Bali saying that it's very clear that the majority of the G20 countries are speaking out to say, hey, let's work harder for peace in Ukraine. So I think the West, therefore, will begin to find that initially what they thought was them working with the rest of the world on the subject, they find that the rest of the world is now moving away from them. And if the West wants to understand this better, I think what they should do is to study very carefully a country that the West is very comfortable with now, and actually in many ways, sometimes many in the West see as now a new ally of the West. And of course, that country is India. India is the world's largest democracy. So when the West says that, hey, this is as you know, has been said many times by the West, this is a contest between democracies and autocracies. And if they really believe that, then they should ask themselves the question, what is the position of the world's largest democracy, which is India? Now, India clearly didn't approve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But as I said at the very beginning of my remarks, India also didn't condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And if you want to understand why, there are actually very sound historical reasons why India hasn't condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. For a start, this is a fact. India still gets most of its arms from Russia. This is a legacy going back to the days of the old Soviet Union, when actually, as you know, the United States actually was the country that was applying pressure on India, certainly after India invaded East Pakistan to liberate the people of East Pakistan, which later became the state of Bangladesh. And at that time, as you all know, the United States actually sent an aircraft carrier. Both President Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger sent an aircraft carrier into the Bay of Bengal to threaten India. And from those days, India switched to move closer to Moscow and bought most of its arms from Moscow, and still continues to do so today. So that's one reason why India obviously have want to maintain its close ties with Russia. And equally importantly, and I say this as someone who was ambassador to the UN for over 10 years, the most powerful international body in the world is the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council is the only body in the world that can impose mandatory sanctions on all countries in the world. So when India was having problems with its neighbors, and India wanted one permanent member of the UN Security Council to support it. And as you know, there are 5 permanent members in the UN Security Council: United States, China, UK, France, and Russia. The only permanent member that has always been consistently sympathetic to India's position, and in fact vetoed any measures that could damage India, that country was Russia. So that is a very deep well of trust within India towards Russia, which is not going to be removed by the Ukraine war, and which also explains why India is taking a very careful, independent position on the Ukraine war. So here, if the West wants to understand what is China's position on the Ukraine war, actually, even though the interests of China and India are different in many ways, in many areas, and of course, you also know there is some rivalry between China and India in many significant areas. Despite all that, when it comes to the Ukraine war, there's a remarkable coincidence of views between China and India on the Ukraine war. And so therefore, if the West is trying to understand China's position, it's got to understand that China is not isolated in its position on the Ukraine war. In some ways, China's position is actually more in harmony with the position of most countries in the world than that of the West towards the Ukraine war. So I hope that in all my remarks today, what I have done is to bring out the complexity of the subject, and I hope that will enable you to have a better understanding of one of the most difficult and problematic issues of our time. Thank you very much.
姐妹们总烦恼脸上细纹干燥与暗沉，现在起跟我一起放心交给 KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列，它添加5种 EGF， 专门防止肌肤老化，强化皮肤修复，增加肌肤弹性水嫩，轻松抚平皱纹，换回青春自信。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹，护肤露、全效精华、精华霜，即刻启动冻龄密码。